Everyone remembers the name Babyface Nelson, a short man with a young face and one of the shortest tempers in the history of American crime. He was born Lester Gillis in Chicago in 1908, the son of immigrants, and he was dead before he turned 26. In that brief life, he robbed banks across the Midwest, sprayed gunfire down public streets, and killed more FBI agents than any other criminal in the Bureau's history. By the closing weeks of 1934, the government had run out of bigger names to chase, and it pinned the title of Public Enemy Number 1 on him. That is the version most people know, a lone gunman with a baby face and a machine gun. The truth is that Nelson never worked alone. Behind that one famous name stood a long line of other men, and one woman who taught him, hid him, robbed beside him, and in most cases, died young for the privilege. Some were seasoned professionals who showed a violent amateur how the trade actually worked. Some were bootleggers and old friends from the West Coast who followed him into the worst decision of their lives. One of them was the most wanted man in the country, and history remembers his face far better than it remembers Nelson's. And one was the wife who stood beside him from before the first robbery to the moment he died in her arms. Today we go behind Babyface Nelson. We look at the people who made him possible, the crews he built and burned through, and the network that turned a Chicago tire thief into the last name on the FBI's list. For every one of them, we ask the same things: who they really were, how their path crossed his, what they built together, and what it cost them when it all came apart. And at the end of each, we put a number on the table. A threat level that tells you, in plain terms, how dangerous each of these people truly was. Let's start where Nelson started. Before Babyface Nelson ever robbed a bank, before the machine guns and the federal manhunt, he was a kid in the Chicago suburbs looking for a way in. The way in ran through a man named Roger TOUHY. TOUHY was born in Chicago in 1898, the son of an Irish immigrant who worked as a police officer and, rare for that time and place, refused to take a bribe. Roger went the other direction. By the late 1920s, he had built one of the most successful bootlegging operations in the country, and he ran it out of the suburbs northwest of the city, around Des Plaines and Schiller Park. His beer was good. He hired a chemist to make sure of it, and at his peak, he was moving 1,000 barrels a week to a network of 200 bars, clubs, and roadhouses. He put slot machines in drugstores and gas stations across the territory he controlled. In his first year in that racket alone, he and his partner grossed around $1 million. What made TOUHY stand out was how he handled Al Capone. The Chicago outfit wanted his territory, and it wanted to bring in the brothels and gambling that TOUHY kept out. TOUHY's own crew was small, so he bluffed. When Capone sent men to feel him out, TOUHY lined his office walls with guns, borrowed submachine guns from friendly local police, and had armed men wander in and out pretending to take murder orders over the phone. Capone's people left convinced TOUHY commanded an army of hardened killers. He commanded almost no one. The bluff held for years, and the newspapers started calling him TOUHY the Terrible. There is something almost admirable in beating the most feared man in Chicago with a room full of props and a straight face. This is the world Lester Gillis walked into. As a young man, he worked at a filling station that doubled as a hangout for local tire thieves. And from there, he moved into driving bootleg liquor through those same northwest suburbs. That put him around the edges of the TOUHY operation. He was a driver and a young associate, one of many, and the record does not show him as anyone close to TOUHY himself. What it shows is that the TOUHY network was his apprenticeship, the place where a Chicago kid learned how the business actually ran. The connection turned concrete in early 1932. By then, Nelson had been convicted for a string of robberies and sentenced to a term in the state penitentiary at Joliet. During a prison transfer that February, he escaped. He did not manage it on his own. According to later accounts, it was his contacts inside the TOUHY gang who helped move him out of Illinois and sent him west to Reno, where a gambling boss took him in. That escape is the hinge of his whole story. Everything Nelson became, the bank jobs, the killings, the title of public enemy number 1, happened because he got out of that transfer and made it to Nevada. The TOUHY network opened that door. After that, their paths never really crossed again. Nelson went west and built a new life around new people, and the men who come later in this story belong to that second life. TOUHY stayed in Chicago and walked straight into a catastrophe of his own. In 1933, he was framed for the staged kidnapping of a conman named John Factor, a scheme that served the interests of the same outfit he had spent years defying. The evidence against him was thin, and parts of it were later shown to be false. He was convicted anyway and sent away for life. He spent 25 years in prison fighting to prove the frame. A federal judge finally ruled in his favor, and he walked out in November 1959. Less than a month later, gunmen with shotguns cut him down on his sister's front steps. He was 61. As he lay dying, he reportedly said the people who wanted him gone had never forgotten. So the man who gave Nelson his start outlived him by a quarter of a century and lost everything anyway. What destroyed him was a lie built by more powerful men, and all his beer money and all his nerve could not buy it back. Where does that leave TOUHY on the threat level? He was a genuine regional boss with a real business empire and the spine to stare down Capone. And that reach counts for something. His power, though, was built on good beer and clever bluffing far more than on bloodshed. And when the real pressure came, he was destroyed completely. On an honest read, that puts him at a 5. Feared and respected in his own corner of the map, a true operator and still no match for the forces that decided to erase him. What I keep coming back to with TOUHY is how little his story actually has to do with guns. He built real power in those suburbs on good beer, steady bribes, and a bluff so convincing that Capone's own enforcers backed down from a crew that barely existed. That takes a kind of intelligence most of the men in this series never had. And yet the same man who outthought Capone could not outrun a frame-up, because the people who set him up had stopped playing by the rules of the street and were using courts, police captains, and a bought witness instead. For Nelson, TOUHY was the open door, the network that turned a prison transfer into a clean escape to Reno. And without that door, there is no public enemy number 1 a couple of years down the line. The honest read is that TOUHY mattered to Nelson as a system, not as a mentor, and the sources back that up, since there is no real evidence the two men were ever close. What stays with me is the ending. He gave a violent kid his start, survived a quarter of a century in prison for something he did not do, and then died on a doorstep weeks after finally tasting freedom. The street did not forget him, and neither did the men he humiliated. Some men in this story taught Nelson how to rob. This one handed him the introduction that made it possible. His name was ALVIN KARPIS, and he is the reason a Chicago stick-up man turned into a Midwest bank robber. KARPIS was born Albin Karpovicius in Montreal in 1907, the son of Lithuanian immigrants, and he grew up in Topeka, Kansas. He was running with gamblers and bootleggers by the age of 10. Prison came early, and it was inside the Kansas State Penitentiary that he met Fred Barker, one of the sons of the family the newspapers would later call the Bloody Barkers. When the two men were out, they built the Barker-Karpis gang, and within a couple of years it became one of the most dangerous crews in the country. Karpis was the brains of it. Other criminals described him as unusually smart, with a memory that let him hold the details of an entire job in his head. He did not rely on wild gunfire the way some of the men in this series did. He planned. His gang robbed banks, and then it moved into something more lucrative and more dangerous: the kidnapping of wealthy men for enormous ransoms. In 1933, they took Minnesota brewer William Ham and collected $100,000. Soon after, they seized St. Paul banker Edward Bremer and collected $200,000 more. Those two kidnappings brought in a fortune, and they also brought the full weight of the federal government down on the whole crew, because one of the victims' families had a direct line to President Roosevelt himself. Now here is where Nelson enters. In the winter after his 1932 escape, Nelson was hiding out in the West, and in Reno he crossed paths with Karpis, who was there taking time off. The two men were not partners and never ran a job together. What passed between them was one introduction, and it changed everything. Karpis knew a veteran Midwestern bank robber named Eddie BENTZ, and he put Nelson in front of him. That single connection took Nelson out of the world of Chicago home invasions and small jobs and pointed him toward the professional bank work that would define the last 2 years of his life. Think about who was sitting across that table in Reno. The FBI would eventually hand out the title of Public Enemy Number 1 to only 4 men in its history. 2 of them were in that room. One was Nelson, the other was KARPIS. Neither of them carried the title yet, and neither could have known that within 2 years, one would be dead in a ditch outside Chicago and the other would be the last of the 4 still breathing. Because that is exactly how it played out. By the end of 1934, Dillinger was dead, Floyd was dead, and Nelson was dead. KARPIS kept running. Ma and Fred Barker were killed by federal agents in early 1935, and still he kept moving, even pulling off a train robbery in Ohio that seemed to belong to an older century. He became the last big name the Bureau had not closed the book on. In May 1936, agents cornered him in New Orleans, and J. Edgar Hoover flew down to be there for the arrest and take the credit for it in the newspapers. KARPIS was captured alive. He was the only one of the 4 public enemies number 1 who was. That is where his path and Nelson's split for good in the plainest way possible. Nelson died young and violently. KARPIS went to Alcatraz and stayed there for 26 years, longer than any prisoner in the history of that island. He was eventually paroled, deported to Canada, and he died an old man in Spain in 1979, 45 years after the man he once met in Reno was gunned down at 25. So what is the honest threat level on ALVIN KARPIS? He had national reach, he ran a top-tier gang as its planner, and he outlasted every other famous outlaw of the era by years, dying free and old in a foreign country. That combination of reach and durability is exactly what the top of this scale is built to measure. On any fair read, that puts him at an 8. He was never the most violent man in this story, and by a wide margin, he was the hardest to kill. To me, the most interesting thing about KARPIS is that he barely belongs in a story about violent men at all. He was a planner first, a thinker, someone other criminals trusted to hold a whole job in his head and get the details right. That intelligence is exactly why he lasted, and it is why his role in Nelson's life was an introduction rather than a gun. One conversation in Reno, one name passed along, and a Chicago stick-up artist got his door into professional bank robbery. I find it hard to ignore that the 2 of them ended up sharing the same title and could not have had more different endings. Nelson chased every fight and died at 25. KARPIS avoided the ones he could, planned his way around the rest, and outlived the entire era by decades. If you want a lesson in what actually keeps a criminal alive in this world, KARPIS is it, because he had patience and a cool head when almost no one else in this story did. If KARPIS opened the door, Eddie BENTZ was the man waiting on the other side of it. He was the professional who taught Nelson what a bank robbery actually looked like when it was done right. BENTZ was born in 1894 in the country along the Minnesota and South Dakota line, which made him more than a decade older than Nelson and a full generation ahead of him in the trade. He came up through juvenile reformatories and moved into burglary, then safecracking, then armed robbery by his early 20s. What set him apart was patience. BENTZ planned. He studied a bank before he touched it, mapped his escape routes in advance, and treated the work like a craft rather than a thrill. By one crime historian's account, he took part in more than 150 robberies without ever being named or charged, though that figure has never been backed by hard evidence and should be treated as legend rather than fact. Even setting the number aside, the pattern is clear. This was a man who built a long career out of not getting caught. He also lived well on the proceeds. BENTZ collected rare books and rare coins and carried himself with a polish that most stick-up men never had. In 1930, he and another veteran robber named Harvey Bailey's were the prime suspects in a bank job in Lincoln, Nebraska, that took more than $2.5 million, one of the largest robberies in the country up to that time. Neither man was ever charged. In the years that followed, he worked alongside some of the biggest names of the era, including George Kelly, The machine gunner the press turned into a legend. By 1933, BENTZ had eased into a quiet semi-retirement in Indiana. That is where Nelson found him. And it is worth being precise about the direction here because it was Nelson who went looking for BENTZ, not the reverse. The younger man wanted the older man's skill for a job he had in mind, a bank in Grand Haven, Michigan. BENTZ agreed to plan it and run it with him. Grand Haven in August 1933 was the first real bank robbery of Nelson's career in the Midwest, and it carried BENTZ's fingerprints all over the planning. It also showed exactly why the two men were built differently. The job went sideways when the getaway driver panicked and drove off, stranding the crew in the middle of the work. One of the robbers was arrested on the spot. The rest got clear in a second car that BENTZ, the careful one, had thought to leave waiting, and they escaped with around $30,000. A planner always leaves himself a second way out. That habit is probably the only reason the day did not end far worse for everyone involved, Nelson included. Here is the strange part. That botched, half-salvaged job was the thing that convinced Nelson he was ready to lead his own gang. He took a robbery that nearly collapsed and read it as proof that he had graduated. BENTZ had shown him the mechanics, and Nelson walked away certain he no longer needed the teacher. The two men went their separate ways after Grand Haven, and they never worked together again. Their endings tell you everything about the difference between them. Nelson would be dead inside 16 months, gunned down on a road outside Chicago. BENTZ kept doing what he had always done, quietly and carefully. He robbed a bank in Vermont in the summer of 1934 and then seemed to vanish from the record. Federal agents finally caught up with him in Brooklyn in 1936 and found him hiding in a dumbwaiter. He refused to name the men who had worked with him, took a 20-year sentence, and asked the judge to send him to Alcatraz because, as he reportedly put it, all his friends were already there. He was paroled in 1948, went home to Tacoma, and died of a heart attack in 1979 at the age of 85. So where does Eddie BENTZ land on the threat level? He never terrified a city, and he left almost no blood behind him, which normally holds a man low on this scale. What he had instead was pure professional skill and an ability to stay invisible for the better part of 20 years. And that is its own kind of danger to everyone he robbed. On an honest read, that puts him at a 6. Respected in his world for his craft rather than his menace, and one of the very few men in this story to die old in his own bed. I think the real story here is what Grand Haven says about Nelson, not about BENTZ. BENTZ was the genuine article, a craftsman who spent 20 years taking other people's money and almost never leaving a trace. And he tried to pass that discipline to a man who had no patience for it. Nelson watched a job nearly fall apart, watched one of his own crew get arrested, and somehow decided that meant he was ready to run his own show. That is ego reading failure as success, and it tells you where his whole story was heading. BENTZ understood something Nelson never would, that the goal is to walk away clean and rob again next month rather than to win a shootout today. It is no accident that the careful man died in his bed at 85 and the reckless one died at 25. If Nelson had actually listened to the teacher he went looking for, this might be a very different story, and a much longer one for him. With Homer Van Meter, we cross a line. The men before him opened doors and taught lessons. Van Meter got in the car and robbed banks at Nelson's side, and he killed while he did it. Van Meter was born in Fort Wayne, Indiana, in 1905, the son of an alcoholic railroad conductor. He ran away from home in the 6th grade and drifted to Chicago, where he worked as a bellhop and a waiter before the honest work stopped interesting him. By his late teens, he was piling up arrests, larceny, car theft, and then a train robbery in 1925 that sent him to the Indiana Reformatory on a sentence of 10 to 21 years. That prison is where his story really begins, because it is where he met John Dillinger. The two became friends. Remember that? Because it matters later. Van Meter was a strange fit for this world. He was a joker, a wisecracker who could not stop clowning even inside a maximum security prison, and his mouth got him beaten and thrown into solitary more than once. He tried to escape more than once too, and failed every time. On one occasion, soaring through his cell bars and knocking a guard unconscious before he was caught at the gate. He carried a tattoo on his forearm that read, "Hope." Given how his life ran, that word reads like a bad joke he played on himself. He was paroled in the spring of 1933, and that is when he entered Nelson's orbit. The meeting ground was the St. Paul underworld, and in particular a place called the Green Lantern Tavern, a hangout where robbers, fences, and corrupt cops all drank in the same room. Nelson was building a crew, and through those connections he pulled in Van Meter. In October 1933, the two of them robbed the bank in Brainerd, Minnesota together and walked away with $32,000. That job set the pattern for the year that followed. What came next was one of the most violent bank robbing runs in American history. After Dillinger made his own famous escape in March 1934, that old prison friendship pulled the two crews together into what the press called the Second Dillinger Gang. Nelson, Dillinger, Van Meter, Carroll, Green, and Hamilton hit the bank in Sioux Falls, South Dakota for nearly $50,000, and a week later took another $52,000 in Mason City, Iowa. Van Meter was in the middle of all of it, and he was not a passenger. Over the spring of 1934, Van Meter became one of the deadliest members of the gang. In May, when two East Chicago detectives stopped the truck he was driving, Van Meter cut them both down with a submachine gun. Their names were Martin O'Brien and Lloyd Mulvihill, and they were doing routine police work when he killed them. At the end of June, during the gang's last confirmed robbery in South Bend, Indiana, he shot and killed a city police officer named Howard Wagner and took a bullet to the head himself in the same fight and lived. This is the honest measure of the man. He could joke his way through a prison yard and he could kill a working police officer without breaking stride. There is a small, telling moment from that same summer. Trying to hide from the manhunt, Van Meter let an underworld doctor operate on his face to change his appearance. The surgery hurt, the result was poor, and Van Meter's response was to try to kill the doctor on the spot. That was his temper. It is also, in a way, a clue to how his story closed, because somewhere in this stretch he and Nelson quarreled, and the partnership that had carried them through a dozen robberies began to rot. By August 1934, Dillinger was dead, shot outside a Chicago theater, and the gang was coming apart. Van Meter fled to St. Paul, the city where he had always felt safe. That confidence killed him. On August 23rd, 4 heavily armed officers cornered him at a street corner. One of them was Tom Brown, a former police chief so corrupt that Van Meter had once helped fund his campaign for sheriff. The officers said Van Meter ran into an alley and fired at them. What is not in dispute is how it ended. He went down under a wall of shotgun fire, and the coroner later counted 26 buckshot wounds and a single machine gun slug, every one of them entering from the back. Brown kept firing into him after he had already fallen. Van Meter's own family said the police had used him for target practice. He was 28. The story does not end with the shooting because the reason for it came out later. The FBI came to believe that Van Meter had been set up for his money by the St. Paul underworld itself. A local crime boss named Harry Sawyer is thought to have arranged the betrayal to get at the $10,000 Van Meter was carrying, and to have split that cash with the same 4 officers who did the shooting. If that is true, and the Bureau believed it was, then the men who cornered him that day were closer to armed robbers than to lawmen. The same corrupt world that had sheltered Van Meter for years turned on him the moment his pockets made him worth more dead than alive. So where does Homer Van Meter land on the threat level? He was as dangerous as almost anyone in this story when he had a gun in his hands. A man who killed police officers in cold blood and did it more than once. What he never had was reach or staying power. He commanded nothing, controlled no territory, and he was dead at 28 after barely a year at the top. On an honest read, that holds him at a 6, terrifying up close and gone as fast as he arrived. What I find hard to ignore about Van Meter is the way he died, because it says more about that era than any of his robberies do. Here was a man who killed at least 3 police officers, and the thing that finally ended him was his own money. A corrupt crime boss and 4 officers reportedly split his cash and his life between them, and they did it in a city where that kind of arrangement was normal. That is the real disease of the old St. Paul, a place where the line between the police and the robbers had been erased so completely that they could rob and kill the same man together. As for Nelson, this is the first point in the story where the friendships start turning on each other, since Nelson himself is one of the names whispered as a possible betrayer. I do not think we can pin that on him with any confidence, and I will not pretend the evidence is there. What I will say is that Van Meter's fall shows you the shape of the ending coming for all of them. An ending written less by the FBI than by the rotten world these men chose to live in. Tommy Carroll is the one who makes this story hurt a little. Most of the men around Nelson were colleagues, useful and replaceable. Carroll was a friend, and so was his wife, and that changes how his death lands. Carroll was born in 1900, which made him older than most of the crew, and he came to crime from an unusual place. He was a boxer first. He fought in the ring long enough to have his jaw broken, which left him with the heavy lantern jaw that people remembered, and he served in the First World War before any of this began. Through the 1920s, he built a long, scattered record: larceny, robbery, auto theft, arrests in one state after another, some of them beaten in court and some of them not. By the early 1930s, he had done real prison time, and when he talked his way out of a minor charge in St. Paul in 1933, he made the decision that sealed his fate. He wanted into the big time with a professional crew. He got his wish through the same St. Paul underworld that produced the rest of Nelson's gang. Carroll's first job with them was the Brainerd robbery in October 1933, the same score that brought in Van Meter, and from there he became a fixture. He was more than a gunman. When Nelson needed heavier weapons, it was Carroll who drove down to San Antonio to buy them from an underworld gunsmith. And it was Carroll who paid for that errand when a chance meeting with two detectives turned into a gunfight. He killed one of them and wounded the other before he got clear. That was the pattern of his violence. It came in bursts when he was cornered, more than it came by design. His value to the gang went beyond the guns. In early 1934, when the crew wanted to break Dillinger out of the jail in Crown Point, it was Carroll who carried the bribe money into town, precisely because he was not yet a known face and could move without drawing eyes. Dillinger's escape a few days later reshaped the whole story, and Carroll had helped pay for it. When the gang came together for its biggest robberies that spring, Carroll was in the thick of it. At Sioux Falls, he worked the street outside the bank, and by some accounts held a group of police officers at bay almost single-handed. A week later, at the $50,000 robbery in Mason City, Iowa, he was the wheelman who drove them all clear. But what sets Carroll apart from the other gunmen in this story is a friendship. Carroll's wife, Jean Delaney, was tied into this world by blood since her sister was the girlfriend of ALVIN KARPIS. Jean and Tommy grew close to Nelson and his wife Helen, close enough that the two couples were genuine friends rather than partners in a business. When the gang scattered after the disaster at Little Bohemia, and the women, including Jean and Helen, were arrested together, that bond only deepened. For a man like Nelson, who trusted almost no one, Carroll was something rare. That is what makes the end of his story land the way it does. In June 1934, he and Jean were moving carefully, hiding in tourist camps, trying to stay small. They drove into Waterloo, Iowa on an ordinary errand to get Jean fitted for a pair of glasses. A man at a gas station noticed the out-of-state plates piled in the back of Carroll's car and called the police. Two detectives found the car, parked of all places, across the street from the police garage. When they moved in and told Carroll he was under arrest, he reached for his gun, lost it in the scuffle, and ran for an alley. They fired, and 4 of the shots hit him, 3 in the chest and 1 in the spine. He admitted who he was on the way to the hospital, and he died there a few hours later. He was 33. The cost did not stop with him. Jean was sent to prison days later for breaking her parole, and while she was inside, she lost the child she had been carrying, Carroll's child. He was buried in St. Paul, and over the years, even his grave marker went missing. When word reached Nelson and Helen, the loss hit them personally, and they dropped deeper into hiding in the weeks that followed. So, where does Tommy Carroll land on the threat level? He was a capable, dangerous member of a dangerous gang, a man who killed when he was cornered and could handle himself in a robbery from behind the wheel or out on the street. What he did not have was command, territory, or time, and his violence never reached the level of the worst men around him. On an honest read that places him at a 4, a real soldier of that crew, trusted and useful, and one more of them who died young and violent, far from any of the power the word gang is supposed to carry. Before we close this one, here is what stands out to me. Carroll is the reminder that these were more than names on an FBI list. They were people who married, made friends, and left others behind when they died. He was a boxer and a veteran who could have gone 100 other directions, and he chose the crew, and the crew got him killed at 33 over a trip to fit a pair of glasses. That detail says everything about how these lives actually ended. There was no grand last stand for most of them, only a careless moment on an ordinary street. The part that stays with me is Jean, who went to prison and lost their child within days of losing him, and who insisted to the end that the man everyone called a criminal had been kind to her. Both things were true. He was kind to the woman he loved, and he also killed a police officer who was doing his job. For Nelson, losing Carroll was one of the few losses that was truly personal, and I think it drove him further into the corner he would die in. Every gang like this one needs a man who never fires a shot and keeps everyone else alive. For Nelson's crew, that man was Eddie Green. Green was born Harold Eugene Green in Pueblo, Colorado in 1898 and lost his father before he was old enough to remember him. He grew into one of the most useful criminals of his generation, though almost none of that usefulness involved a gun. Green was what the underworld called a jug marker, the man who chose which bank was worth robbing. He cased targets for weeks. He drove the escape routes himself in advance until he knew every turn. And beyond the planning, he had something even rarer, a set of connections to corrupt police and politicians in St. Paul that let him arrange safe houses and get early warning of raids. In a city where the law was for sale, Green was the man who knew which officials were buying. He came up through the biggest names of the early 1930s. He robbed banks alongside veterans like Frank Nash and rode for a time with the KARPIS gang, the same crew KARPIS ran. Green grew unhappy with how the Barker brothers operated, and late in 1933, he went looking for a new home. He found it with Babyface Nelson. Green joined Nelson's orbit around the same time as Van Meter and Carroll, and in fact, it was Green who brought Carroll into the gang as an extra gun. When the crew reorganized into the second version of the Dillinger Gang in early 1934, Green was its quiet engine. You can see his hand on the two biggest jobs of that spring. He helped case the bank in Mason City, Iowa, and he drew up the diagrams and the getaway routes the gang used to get out. When they needed somewhere to disappear afterwards, it was Green who provided the safe houses back in St. Paul. He was the infrastructure that made the violence possible, the man who turned a pack of stick-up artists into something that could operate. And that is exactly why his death mattered so much more than the loss of one robber. It started with someone else's mistake. After a shootout with federal agents at the end of March, Dillinger fled and left behind an apartment. And inside it, agents found a telephone number. They traced that number to one of Green's hideouts. On April 3rd, Green pulled up outside that hideout with his common-law wife, got out of the car and walked toward the door. Federal agents were waiting with machine guns, and they opened fire, hitting him in the head and the shoulder. Green was unarmed. The Bureau claimed he had made threatening gestures, but the reports conflicted, and much of the press treated it plainly as the killing of an unarmed man. The criticism was heavy, and it was fair. Then came the part that finished the whole era. Green did not die at the scene. He lingered for 7 days in a hospital, and for that entire week, he was delirious, drifting in and out, talking. Federal agents sat by the bed and wrote down every word. From the ramblings of a dying fixer, the men whose secrets he had spent his career protecting, they pulled the names of the Dillinger Gang, the existence of the KARPIS gang, and the details of the kidnappings that would eventually hang those men. His wife, held for sheltering him, filled in the rest. The one man whose entire value was keeping the gang invisible had, without meaning to and without a shred of control over it, made it visible. He died on April 10th, the first of Nelson's crew to fall, and he took the secrecy of the whole underworld down with him. So where does Eddie Green sit on the threat level? He was not a killer, and he never led anything, which normally keeps a man low. What raises him is the nature of what he did, because a gang can always find another trigger man, and it cannot easily replace the one who knows which banks to hit, which routes to drive, and which police will look away. On an honest read, that puts him at a 4 and a quiet one. His danger lived in the machine he kept running for men far more violent than himself, the casing and the roots and the bought police, and that machine held right up until the day it could no longer hide him. What catches my attention with Green is the irony, and it is a brutal one. This was the most careful man in the gang, the one who planned every route and bought every cop, the professional whose whole job was making sure the others never got caught, and in the end, he is the reason they did. It happened across 7 days of delirium he could not control, lying in a hospital bed while federal agents copied down his every word. There is a hard lesson in that about the limits of control. You can plan the perfect job and buy the perfect protection, and none of it matters once a bullet puts you somewhere you cannot guard your own mouth. I also think Green's death is the exact moment the tide turned against all of them. Before April 1934, the FBI was chasing shadows. After Green, they had names and the whole crew started dying in order. The fixer who kept them hidden was, without ever meaning to be, the one who lit them up. Every other person in this story is known because of Babyface Nelson. This one is the exception. John Dillinger was more famous than Nelson while both men were alive, and he is more famous than Nelson today. For a stretch of 1934, the two of them robbed banks together, and understanding how that partnership worked tells you almost everything about who Nelson really was. Dillinger was born in Indianapolis in 1903, and his path into crime started with a single bad decision that the law punished far past reason. In 1924, newly married and unable to find steady work, he and an older ex-convict robbed a grocery store for about $50. His father, a church-going man, convinced him to confess and plead guilty without a lawyer, certain the court would go easy on a young first offender who cooperated. The court sentenced him to 10 to 20 years. Dillinger walked into prison at 21, already bitter, and he told the staff he would come out the meanest man they had ever seen. He spent 9.5 years inside, learning the trade from seasoned bank robbers, and when he was paroled in 1933, he made good on that promise immediately. What came next made him a national figure. Over about 14 months, Dillinger and his crews were tied to more than 20 bank robberies. He escaped from custody twice, once in a jailbreak so bold that people still argue over whether the gun he used was real or a piece of wood he had carved and blackened. The newspapers turned him into a folk hero, a Robin Hood robbing the same banks that had foreclosed on half the country. And he played the part, smiling for cameras and building the image on purpose. That image is a large part of why he stayed less violent than his reputation suggested. In his entire career, he was charged with killing only one man, a police officer, and even that was disputed. Dillinger wanted the money and the legend. The body count was never the point for him. Here is where Nelson comes in, and the way the two men connected says a great deal. In early 1934, Dillinger was sitting in a jail in Crown Point, Indiana, waiting on a murder charge. The escape that made him a legend was arranged and paid for in part by Nelson's newly formed gang, with Tommy Carroll carrying the bribe money into town. When Dillinger walked out of that jail on March 3rd, he headed for St. Paul, met up with Nelson's crew, and the two operations merged. The press called the result the Second Dillinger Gang, and the name itself is the first clue to the strange dynamic underneath it. The most dangerous gunman in that group was Nelson. Yet Dillinger's fame was so enormous that the whole crew took his name, even though it had no real leader. The two of them could not have been less alike, and that difference is the heart of it. Dillinger was a planner who had studied the craft of bank robbery like a trade, careful with his image and reluctant to leave bodies behind that would only bring more heat. Nelson was his opposite in every way that mattered. He was a hair trigger, a man who sprayed gunfire at bystanders and police alike and seemed to enjoy the fight for its own sake. Historians generally agree that Nelson's recklessness was a constant problem for Dillinger, because every innocent person Nelson shot turned up the national outrage and the federal pressure on all of them. A careful thief does not want a partner who treats every traffic stop as a chance to start a war. Still, for a few months in 1934, the partnership held, and it was productive and violent. Together, the gang robbed the bank in Sioux Falls, South Dakota for nearly $50,000 and the one in Mason City, Iowa for more than $50,000 more. In April, the whole crew was nearly trapped by federal agents at a Wisconsin resort called Little Bohemia, in a raid so badly handled that the agents killed an innocent bystander and let every one of the outlaws escape. Nelson, during that escape, killed a federal agent, which turned him from one name among many into a personal target of the Bureau. Their last confirmed job together came at the end of June, a robbery in South Bend, Indiana, where a police officer was killed and Van Meter took a bullet to the head and lived. Then Dillinger's fame caught up with him. In July 1934, he was hiding in Chicago under a false name, living quietly, when a woman he trusted gave him up. Her name was Anna Kumpanash, a Romanian immigrant and brothel keeper who was facing deportation and hoped that helping the government would let her stay. She told federal agents that Dillinger would be at the Biograph Theater, and she agreed to be there beside him so they could pick him out. Agents shot him dead in the alley next to the theater as he left the film. She was deported to Romania anyway. And this is the part that matters most for our story. Dillinger's death did not end the manhunt. It moved it. With the most famous outlaw in America gone, the Bureau needed a new face for its list, and after Pretty Boy Floyd was killed a few months later, that face became Babyface Nelson. The title of public enemy number one, the one the public still attaches to Dillinger, was handed to Nelson only because Dillinger died first. The man who had ridden in Dillinger's shadow inherited his crown, and he would wear it for barely a month before he died too. So where does John Dillinger sit on the threat level? And this is the hardest call in the whole story. His reach was as large as anyone's here. He robbed banks across the country, he escaped custody more than once, and he handed J. Edgar Hoover the excuse to build the modern FBI. But this scale measures how dangerous a man was as an operator, and fame is not the same thing as danger. Dillinger killed very few people, and his entire run lasted only about 14 months before it ended in an alley. On an honest read that places him at a 7. Enormous reach, a real talent for the work, and a legend far larger than the body count behind it. Dillinger was the careful one who barely killed anyone. And Nelson was the genuine menace, the man who shot bystanders and federal agents and treated a gunfight like a good time. Riding with Nelson was probably the most dangerous decision Dillinger ever made, because Nelson's recklessness poured heat on the whole gang that a smarter operator would have avoided. What gets me is the final irony of it. Dillinger's fame is the reason we call that crew the Dillinger Gang. And Dillinger's death is the only reason Nelson ever got the title of public enemy number one. Nelson spent his whole career one step behind the famous man, and he reached the top of the list only by outliving him for about 4 weeks. In this world, being the most famous and being the most dangerous were rarely the same thing, and these two are the proof. John Hamilton was Dillinger's man first and last. He came from the other half of the gang, the prison world that produced Dillinger himself, and he crossed paths with Nelson only near the end. But the way that path closed, with Nelson helping to put him in the ground, makes him impossible to leave out. Hamilton was born in Ontario, Canada in 1898, which made him one of 2 Canadians in this story, alongside Karpis. As a boy, he lost 2 fingers on his right hand in a sledding accident, and the underworld gave him the name Three Finger Jack. His serious record began with a robbery in Indiana in 1927 that carried a 25-year sentence, and it was inside the state prison at Michigan City that his real life started. There he befriended John Dillinger, Homer Van Meter, and the core of the men who would become the first Dillinger Gang. These were the friendships that would define and end his life. When Dillinger was paroled in 1933, he did not forget the men he had left behind. He arranged for guns to be smuggled into the prison, and that September, 10 armed convicts walked out of the main gate, Hamilton among them. What followed was a season of loyalty running in both directions. When Dillinger was arrested soon after, Hamilton and the others robbed a bank specifically to fund an operation to free him. Hamilton was there in October when the crew broke Dillinger out of an Ohio jail, though he stayed outside and had no hand in the killing of the sheriff that made it possible. Hamilton was a working gunman, and a dangerous one. In December 1933, cornered at a Chicago garage by a detective who had come to ask about his car, Hamilton opened fire and killed the officer before slipping away. The pattern there is worth noticing because it is the same one that would end Carroll and nearly end others. A mechanic gets suspicious of a gangster's car, makes a phone call, and a man ends up dead. There is a lesson in how small the thing was that undid these men over and over. The most telling moment of Hamilton's career is one that history usually credits to someone else. In January 1934, during a robbery in East Chicago, a police officer named William O'Malley was shot dead. Dillinger was charged with that murder, and it became the one killing officially hung on his name. But several witnesses said the man who actually fired was Hamilton. If they were right, then the single homicide that defined Dillinger's legal reputation was really the work of his quiet, three-fingered friend, who got neither the credit nor the blame. Hamilton himself was shot twice in that same robbery, which was becoming a habit. He seemed to catch a bullet in nearly every major job he ran. His time in Nelson's orbit was short. After Dillinger's Crown Point escape in March 1934, Hamilton joined the merged crew alongside Nelson, Van Meter, Carroll, and Green, and he rode with them through the big robberies of that spring. At Sioux Falls, he was in the thick of it, and at Mason City, he was wounded yet again, shot in the shoulder by an elderly man firing from across the street. When the gang was surprised at Little Bohemia in April, Hamilton went out a second-floor window onto frozen snow and ran for the lake with the others. His luck ran out the next day. On April 23rd, near Hastings, Minnesota, the gang ran into a police roadblock, and in the shootout that followed, a bullet caught Hamilton as they sped away. This wound did not kill him cleanly. He lingered. The gang carried him to an underworld doctor in Chicago who, for reasons of his own, refused to treat him, and so Dillinger hid his dying friend in a house in Aurora, Illinois, and waited. Hamilton held on for days before he died, sometime in the final days of April. Then came the part that ties him to Nelson. Hamilton was buried in secret in a field near Oswego, Illinois. Dillinger dug the grave, and by the account tied to Nelson, Nelson was there too, having rejoined the gang in Aurora. Before they covered him over, they poured lye on Hamilton's face and hands to destroy any chance that the body could later be identified. It nearly worked. For years afterward, the law did not even know he was dead. They indicted him for crimes weeks after he was already in the ground, and rumors drifted for a long time that Three Finger Jack was still alive somewhere in Canada. Only later did dental records confirm that the body in the field was his. So where does John Hamilton land on the threat level? He was a seasoned and genuinely violent robber who killed at least one police officer and very likely a second, and he stood near the center of the most wanted gang in America. What he lacked was reach beyond that crew and any real durability, since he spent most of his final year catching bullets and died slowly at 35. On an honest read, that places him at a 5. Feared and dangerous inside his own world, loyal to the friend who buried him, and erased so completely that for years, no one was even certain that he was gone. Hamilton is the forgotten man of this whole story, and something about that feels almost deliberate. He may have fired the shot that killed O'Malley, the one murder that defined Dillinger in the eyes of the law, and he let his famous friend carry it without a word. He caught bullets in robbery after robbery and kept climbing back into the car for the next one. And when he finally died, slowly and in hiding, his reward was a field grave and a face burned with lye so that no one would ever know him. There is a brutal loyalty running through all of it, the kind these men reserved for the very few people they trusted, and Hamilton got the full measure of it in both directions. Dillinger risked everything to break him out of prison, and Dillinger dug his grave with his own hands. For Nelson, standing over that grave is one of the quieter things we know about him, and it says something that even a man like him would help bury a comrade in secret rather than leave him for the law. In a story full of loud deaths, Hamilton's is the one that simply disappeared. And that silence is the most honest picture of what this life actually offered them. After a run of killers and professionals, we come to a different kind of man entirely. Joseph Negri, known in the underworld as Fatso, was not a robber or a planner or a gunman. He mattered to Nelson's story for two reasons only. He was there at the end, and afterward, he talked. The honest truth is that very little about Negri's early life is on the record. He surfaces as a fixture of the San Francisco Bay Area underworld, the same West Coast world Nelson fled to after his 1932 prison escape. While Nelson was hiding out in California and running liquor for a local bootlegger, he fell in with a circle of Bay Area criminals and two of them stuck. One was John Paul Chase, who we will come to next. The other was Fatso Negri. When Nelson decided to rebuild for a new wave of bank robberies, he reached back to that California circle and pulled both men east. Chase became something close to a partner. Negri became a gopher. He was the errand runner, the low man who fetched cars, carried supplies, ran messages, and stayed close enough to the action to see everything while remaining too far down the ladder to be worth a bullet. In a gang of men who shot police officers and robbed banks in daylight, Negri was the one sent out for the groceries. That position is exactly why he is useful to us today. Because he was present through the gang's final months. And because he lived, Negri later became one of the sources for what actually happened in that period. It is partly through his account that we know who was likely in the room for the gang's last robbery in South Bend, including the possibility that Pretty Boy Floyd rode with them that day. The errand boy saw things the shooters took to their graves, and then Nelson died in November 1934. And with him died the gang. This is the moment that defines Negri. With his boss gone and the whole operation finished, Negri did what men in his position have always done. He turned government witness. He gave the authorities what he knew, and he testified in the cases against the people who had sheltered Nelson while the manhunt closed in. It would be easy to call that a betrayal, but the facts complicate the drama. By the time Negri talked, Nelson was already dead, the era was over, and every important gunman in this story was in the ground, or soon would be. A low-level errand runner with no protection and no future in a dead gang made the only rational choice left to him, which was to talk rather than take a fall for a corpse. It is hard to read that as either courage or treachery. It was survival, plain and simple, and survival was the one skill Negri clearly had. So where does Fatso Negri land on the threat level? And this one is simple. He commanded no one, he killed no one, and he was replaceable from the first day to the last. He touched greatness only in the sense that he stood near dangerous men and carried their bags. On an honest read that places him at a 2, the lowest number in this story, and fittingly so, the only lasting mark Negri left was made from a witness chair, describing the men he had once run errands for. The informants in these stories usually get painted as cowards, but most of them were doing simple math. Talk or take a fall for people who are already dead and cannot help you. Negri was never a killer or a mastermind. He was the man who carried the bags. And when the gang that employed him was wiped off the map, he had nothing left to protect and no reason to protect it. What interests me more is the pattern he fits. Look at who survived this whole story. The careful planners like KARPIS and BENTZ lived because they were good at the work, and the low men like Negri lived because they were willing to talk. The ones who died were the shooters and the loyalists. The men who either loved the violence or loved each other too much to run. Negri is proof that in this world, the way you stayed alive was rarely the way anyone would ever want to be remembered. We come now to the last man standing. Of everyone who rode with Babyface Nelson, John Paul Chase stayed the longest, stood beside him at the very end, and paid for it with more of his life than anyone else in this story. Chase was born in San Francisco in 1901, and for the first 3 decades of his life, there was nothing remarkable about him. He left school young, worked on a ranch, then in a railroad yard, then drove a car for a professional gambler in Reno. He ran a little liquor around the Bay Area during Prohibition. He was a small man in a small corner of the underworld, and he might have stayed that way for good. Then he met Babyface Nelson, and Nelson made him into something else. They came together in the same California and Nevada world that produced FATSO NEGRI, most likely in Reno around 1932. By one account, Chase served as the wheelman for a killing Nelson carried out there. Whatever the exact beginning, Nelson found in Chase a man who would follow him without question, and that loyalty became the defining fact of Chase's life. When Nelson went east to rob banks, Chase went with him. The two robbed their first bank together at Brainerd, Minnesota, in October 1933, and from that point on, wherever Nelson went, Chase was somewhere close behind. His actual rank in the gang was low. Like Negri, Chase spent most of his time as a gopher, fetching food, buying guns and ammunition, and carrying messages between Nelson and Dillinger. That low status is probably what kept him alive through the worst of it, because he was not important enough to be at Little Bohemia when the raid came down. But Chase was more than an errand boy. The FBI later determined that in March 1934, Chase and Nelson together abducted and killed a man named Roy Fritch, a witness against Nelson's old bosses in Reno. His body was never found. That killing is the clearest proof that Chase had crossed fully into Nelson's world and that his loyalty came with blood on it. Through the second half of 1934, the gang around them fell apart. Dillinger was shot in July, Van Meter in August, and one by one the others followed. Through all of it, Chase stayed with Nelson. When the two of them ran, they ran together. And on November 27, 1934, on a road outside Barrington, Illinois, they came to the end of it together as well. That day, Nelson and Chase were spotted by federal agents. And what began as a chase reversed until Nelson was hunting the men who had been hunting him. In the gun battle that followed, Chase fired on the agents while Nelson, already badly wounded, walked straight into their fire and killed both of them before he fell. Nelson's last reckless stand did one useful thing in the end. It bought Chase the time to get away. Chase loaded the dying Nelson into a car and drove him to a safe house where Nelson died that night with Helen beside him. Then Chase was alone, the last member of the gang still free. He did not stay free for long, and here his path splits hard from Negri's. Where Negri would talk, Chase ran. He slipped out of Chicago under a false name, drove a car west, and took a job at a fish hatchery near Mount Shasta, California, trying to disappear back into the ordinary life he had come from. It was Nelson's widow, Helen, who finally gave his name to the authorities. Chase was arrested at the end of December 1934, barely a month after Nelson's death. What happened next was shaped by one man's personal hatred. Chase was the first person ever charged under a new federal law that made it a crime to kill a federal agent, and he was convicted of the murder of one of the agents who died at Barrington. He was sent to Alcatraz, and there he might have served an ordinary sentence and been paroled in time. But J. Edgar Hoover never forgot who had been in that car when his agents died. Hoover called Chase a rat with a patriotic-sounding name, and he personally intervened to block his release for years, once ordering agents to watch and thwart a prison chaplain who had dared to support Chase's parole. Because of that grudge, Chase served nearly 20 years on Alcatraz, the second longest stretch on that island after KARPIS, and 32 years in prison all told. He became a different man inside those walls. A chaplain taught him to paint, and Chase turned out to have a real gift for it. One of his known works shows a boat named for himself sailing away towards San Francisco, painted from the point of view of the island, a picture of the freedom he was watching from a distance and would not touch for decades. He worked as a cobbler, sold his paintings, and waited. When he was finally paroled in 1966, he went home to the Bay Area, took a job as a custodian at a seminary, and lived quietly until cancer took him in 1973. He outlived J. Edgar Hoover, the man who had kept him caged by a little more than a year. So where does John Paul Chase land on the threat level? And the honest answer sits oddly against how much he matters to this story. As an operator, he was never much. He commanded no one, he planned nothing, and his violence came as Nelson's follower rather than on his own account, though the Fritch killing and the death of a federal agent are real weight. On an honest read that places him at a 4. A blooded man and a true accomplice, but a follower to the end. What the number cannot capture is that this low-ranking gopher was the one person who stayed with Nelson all the way to the last road and who then paid for that loyalty with 32 years. A price far heavier than his rank ever earned. The thing that stays with me about Chase is how close he came to being NEGRI, and how far apart the two of them ended up. Both were small men from the same California underworld. Both were gophers who fetched guns and carried messages. Both were nobodies that Nelson pulled up into something bigger than they were built for. When it all collapsed, NEGRI talked and walked away, and Chase kept his mouth shut and gave up 32 years of his life. I'm not going to pretend one of those choices was noble and the other shameful, because loyalty to a man like Nelson was its own kind of trap. But there is something almost unbearable in what that loyalty cost him. He sat in a cell and painted a boat sailing off to a freedom he would not touch for decades, held there past all reason by an FBI director who took the death of his agents personally. In the one small mercy the story allows, Chase walked out at last, lived a quiet and ordinary life, and outlived the man who hated him. He is the closest thing this story has to a survivor who actually paid the full bill. We end where the whole story began, with the one person who was there before the first robbery and there for the last breath. Her name was Helen, and she was Nelson's wife. Helen Wawrzyniak was born in 1908, the same year as the man she would marry. They met when they were both young, and in 1928, when Helen was expecting their first child, the two of them wed. She was barely 20. At that point, Lester Gillis was still a neighborhood kid drifting toward trouble, and none of the robberies, the killings, or the famous name had happened yet. Helen married the man before there was ever a legend to marry. That is worth holding on to because it makes her connection to Nelson different from everyone else's in this story. The others attached themselves to babyface Nelson. Helen married Lester Gillis. They had 2 children together, a son named Ronald and a daughter named Darlene. As Nelson sank deeper into crime and then into the manhunt, the children were largely raised by a sister in Chicago, while Helen chose the road. She traveled with her husband through the worst of it. She was with him and the gang as they moved between hideouts, and she was there often enough that the law came to regard her as part of the operation rather than a bystander to it. That treatment became official at Little Bohemia. When the FBI raided the lodge in April 1934, Helen was among the women captured inside. She was interrogated, charged with harboring, and released on parole. A woman in her position might have taken that as a chance to step away. Helen violated her parole and went straight back to her husband. Whatever else you make of her, the choice was hers, and she made it with her eyes open. So she was there at the end on the road outside Barrington in November 1934. When the shooting started, Nelson shouted at her to get down in a roadside ditch, and from there, she watched him take the wounds that would kill him. After it was over, she and John Paul Chase got the dying Nelson into a car and drove him to a safe house in Wilmette. He died there that night, and by every account, he died with Helen beside him. Before she left, she wrapped his body in a blanket. When she was later asked why, she said it was because he had always hated being cold. Then she and Chase carried him out, left him in a ditch beside a cemetery, and she vanished into the Chicago streets alone. What the government did next tells you how far the fury ran. J. Edgar Hoover reportedly issued an order to find the woman and give her no quarter, and the newspapers ran with it, calling the grieving widow the first female public enemy in the country. For a few days, she wandered the city as a hunted fugitive. Then, on Thanksgiving Day, Helen surrendered. She was sent to a women's reformatory in Michigan and served a year and a day for the crime of sheltering her own husband. And then, Helen Gillis did the hardest thing in this entire story. She lived. She got out in 1935, went home to Chicago, and stayed there for the rest of a long life. She never remarried. She raised her children, stayed close to Nelson's family, and rarely spoke about him at all. When she did, it was without shame. In a rare interview late in her life, she said she had no regrets, that she had loved her husband and would do all of it again. She asked only that people let him rest. Helen died in 1987 at 73, more than 50 years after the man she married bled out in her arms. At her own request, she was buried beside him. So where does Helen Gillis land on the threat level? And this is the one time the whole scale falls apart, because it was built to measure something she never was. Helen commanded no one, planned nothing, and hurt no one. By the only honest reading, that makes her a 1, the bottom of a scale designed for dangerous men. But putting a number on Helen misses her entirely. She is in this story for the opposite reason from everyone else. She is here as the human cost of all the others, the woman who loved a violent man, buried him young, and carried that grief quietly for half a century. Of everyone behind Babyface Nelson, she stood the closest and paid the longest, and she never fired a shot. I want to be careful with Helen, because it would be easy to turn her into either a villain or a saint, and she was neither. She knew what her husband was. She saw the bodies and the blood and the running, and she chose him anyway, again and again, right up to the ditch where he told her to hide while he died. You can call that love, or you can call it a kind of ruin, and it was probably both. What moves me is the 53 years that came after. Every man in this story got a fast, loud ending, and Helen got the slow one. The decades of silence, the grave she tended, the questions she would not answer. She carried the whole thing alone longer than most of these men were even live. When people asked whether she regretted it, she said no. And I believe her, because a woman who spent half a century refusing to disown a dead bank robber was telling the truth about the one thing she had left. In the end, the people truly behind Babyface Nelson were the ones who loved him and paid for it. And Helen paid the most for the longest and asked for nothing in return except that we let him rest. We started with a simple idea that Babyface Nelson never worked alone. 11 people later, that idea has turned into something larger. Every one of these lives tells you something Nelson himself could not, because you learn the most about a man from the people willing to stand next to him. Look at how they scored, and a pattern comes clear that has almost nothing to do with fame. The highest number in this story goes to a man most people have never heard of. ALVIN KARPIS lands at an 8, above both of the famous names, and he earned it by doing the one thing none of the others could. He lasted. He had national reach and the patience to survive, and he died an old man in Spain more than 40 years after the friend he met in Reno was cut down at 25. This scale rewards the man who is hard to stop, and Karpis was the hardest to stop of all of them. Below him sit the two famous names, and it is telling that they land in the same place. Dillinger and Nelson both come in at a 7 for opposite reasons. Dillinger earned his through reach, a national legend built on more than 20 robberies and a body count that stayed surprisingly low. Nelson earned his through sheer violence, a man who killed more federal agents than any criminal before him. One had the fame and the restraint, the other had the ferocity and the short fuse. The scale sees them as equally dangerous, which is the truth the movies never tell you. Then come the professionals and the killers, paired off. Eddie BENTZ and Homer Van Meter both reach a 6, one for a craft that kept him invisible for 20 years, the other for a gun that killed 3 officers in a single spring. Roger TOUHY and Red Hamilton both hold a 5, the suburban boss who bluffed his way past Capone, and the loyal gunman who let his famous friend take the blame for his kill. Tommy Carroll, Eddie Green, and John Paul Chase all settle at a 4, the soldier, the fixer, and the man who stayed to the end. FATSO NEGRI sits near the bottom at a 2, the errand boy whose one lasting act was to talk. And Helen, who was never a threat to anyone, stands off the scale entirely. The human cost the numbers were never built to measure. Set all of it side by side, and the real lesson of this story stops being about danger at all. It becomes about survival and about the price of it. The men who lived longest were the careful ones and the ones who were willing to talk. The men who died youngest were the shooters and the loyal, the ones who either loved the violence too much or loved each other too much to run. Almost none of them were undone by some grand federal masterstroke. They were undone by small things: a suspicious mechanic, a phone number in an abandoned apartment, a delirious week in a hospital bed, a trip into town to fit a pair of glasses. Which brings us back to the man at the center of it. If we put Babyface Nelson himself on the threat level, he lands at a 7. He was as violent as anyone this country ever produced, and he wore the title of Public Enemy #1. But he held that crown for barely a month, and he was dead at 25. Ferocity like his makes a man terrifying, and it burns him out fast. Here is what stays with me after all of it. We call this the story of Babyface Nelson, but the people around him tell the truth about him better than his own legend ever could. The teachers showed him a trade he was too reckless to respect. The gunman matched his violence and died for it the same way he did. The planners quietly outlived him because they never needed the fight. And the ones who loved him, Carroll and his wife and Helen most of all, paid a price that had nothing to do with money or fame, and everything to do with the simple mistake of caring about a violent man. In the end, that is the oldest lesson this era has to offer. The men chasing power and the men chasing each other both burned out fast, and the ones left standing over the graves were the quiet, the careful, and the loved. Nelson got the famous name and the shortest life in this whole story. Everyone who stood behind him paid in one currency or another for the privilege. That is what the people behind Babyface Nelson were really for, and it is why their stories, and not only his, are the ones worth telling.